You're listening to the Kangaroo Courts podcast. I'm Theodore, and our theme at the moment is queerness in the law. This episode is looking at gender.
They call me Hell, they call me Stacy, they call me Her, they call me Jane. That's not my name, that's not my name, that's not my name, that's not my name.
So we're talking about gender diversity and gender recognition in the context of legal practice. I also had the opportunity to speak to Charlotte Tortorella.
Hi, I'm Charlotte. I'm a local trans advocate from New South Wales,
who will be sharing her experiences of being a gender diverse programmer with us today.
for the last year. Yeah, it's been a little bit over a year. I've been making a podcast with a few other trans people called Trans General.
So first up, what's the problem that we're grappling with? We're grappling with trans people not being sure whether to come out at work, whether to change how they dress at work, whether or not their work will be affected by their transition, whether or not their employers will accept their transition, because not everyone has the same transition, no one follows the same path. The Scottish Transgender Alliance still says that the workplace is one of the most likely places for transphobic discrimination to occur, so we're talking about gossip, bullying, actual discrimination at recruitment, discrimination over people asking for time off to transition. So there's a lot of factors in play here. So let's start by talking about employers. So what exactly is the employer's role during someone's transition? Now, I think the first step is having a solid transgender policy. So this is an actual document that's been written up with guidelines, with suggestions, with terms defined. A transgender employee comes to you and says, well, look, here's what I want to do. You don't stand around with your mouths open. That's the first step. Next, you need to make sure you're using appropriate language to make sure gender diverse employees, clients, and coworkers feel safe and included. And using appropriate language doesn't just mean learning the terms. Once. It means constantly educating yourself and cultivating a culture at your workplace where people make an effort to know and understand the appropriate language from time to time. First of all, this means no slurs, which may be different depending on the culture you find yourself in. Don't refer to trans people as cross-dressers or transsexuals. In fact, don't reduce people to their trans identities unless it is specifically relevant to the situation. A trans man should be considered a man for all intents and purposes if that's what he prefers. Secondly, look up words. Here's some homework for you. Look up the words genderqueer, non-binary, passing, intersex, cisgender, and how to use singular pronouns other than he and she. You'll thank me later. Seriously, educate yourself. It's not hard, and it's not our job to do it for you. You're listening to Kangaroo Courts.
As employers and employees in a professional industry, we need to make sure we're avoiding cisgenderist and assumed language that puts the onus on trans and gender diverse people to speak up if they want to be recognised.
Because I remember I wrote non-binary on something once, and someone picked up the form and was like non-binary, and I was like, are you serious?
So, for instance, using terms like opposite and both sexes, we're assuming that only two sexes exist and denying the experiences of those whose bodies do not fall within these binary categories. Furthermore, because our concept of gender uses the same language of male and female as we do when we're talking about biological sex, we also deny the experiences of those whose gender experience falls outside of the male and female binary.
So if people stop designing databases that have 3 checkboxes, maybe instead of that we could start doing just a text entry box, because you'll never get them all and you're always going to be othering someone. So you should just give people a text box and have no default. Yeah, I'm really hopeful that places will start catching on to that kind of thing.
We also need to think about the terms we're using to describe people's bodies. So if we're talking about the term biological woman, we're using it to differentiate between cis and trans women, and this implies there's a truth underlying the term woman that only people with uteruses can represent, and this is exclusionary to both trans women and trans men. We need to break away from the assumptions that we're dealing with when we're talking about language, and we need to start thinking about the words we're using and what impact they can have on those around us. A great reference book for reading further on this is Sex, Gender, Sexuality and the Law, Social and Legal Issues Faced by Individuals, Couples and Families, written by Samantha Hardy, Olivia Rundle and Damien Riggs. So there have been a couple of cases that have reached the High Court which have looked at gender diversity in terms of legal recognition. So first of all, there's Norrie's case, where the High Court permitted an individual to record their sex as non-specific on their birth certificate. So this leads me back to the idea that there's no reason for someone to need to disclose their sex at all to an employer, and forms really should be asking for gender, if anything. So the other interesting case is about 2 trans men from Western Australia that applied to the High Court for a gender recognition certificate, and prior to the intervention of the court, the Gender Recognition Board of Western Australia actually rejected their application for gender recognition on the basis that the mere fact of having a uterus and cervix inside their bodies was held to be inconsistent with being male, and the Gender Recognition Board would have required their entire internal reproductive system to be removed before they would have been satisfied about them being male. So in the judgment, the court still talked about gender with reference to the ability to reproduce, but thankfully did not make its judgment on that basis, but rather an expression of masculine characteristics, which is a lot better, but I think still can be viewed as problematic, especially when we want to start talking about non-binary genders,
for which we don't yet have a vocabulary to describe the expression of. You're listening to Kangaroo Courts. The legal industry has overarching principles of professionalism, integrity, and ethics, amounting to a complex duty to the client as well as society at large. Not only may we be barred from practice for breaching this code, but we also risk our reputation as we are held to much higher standards of practice. All of these elements together have turned the legal profession into a customer service-driven field, meaning crisp presentation, client manner, and courtesy all form an integral part. This has become problematic for people whose entire lives and lifestyles fall outside of what is considered socially acceptable. People with gender-fluid identities, people with multiple partners, or people partway through a medical transition. These characteristics are seen as radical, distasteful, or downright wrong by some parts of society, and if these people happen to be lawyers, then they are exposed to reputational losses that straight, cisgender, able-bodied people simply do not experience, especially cisgender men. When you start looking at these issues through an international legal framework, they become even more complicated. Some countries offer similar or better situations of acceptance and tolerance as Australia, but that's not the case everywhere. Even in developed countries like the United States, a change in government can threaten the lives and livelihoods of queer people through a rise in conservative social views. There are also countries where it is still illegal to be gay and trans, and it is not always economically viable for someone to simply avoid travelling to these places. And nor should that be the only answer. Shutting someone out of career opportunities simply because they would be exposed to risk is not an efficient way or fair way for that person to go about their life. We need to be capable of coming up with alternative solutions that allow trans and queer people to maintain connected to their employment.
I'd just pick which cafes I were going to, like, find the ones that don't say thank you ma'am, thank you sir. I just find the ones that are like, here, thanks.
So how do we go about this? How do we become more aware of the issues faced by gender diverse people, and how do we start accommodating them in their workplace rather than forcing them to accommodate themselves to us? We can apply the 5 habits of cross-culturally competent lawyers as developed by Susan Bryant. So first up, looking at both similarities and differences. What do you have in common? What's different between you and your client? Thinking about issues like queerness, disability, language, class, background, schooling, hobbies. How do you relate to someone that you don't share similarities with? How can we make sense to each other? And how can we maintain professionalism without differences if you're too similar? Secondly, we need to start thinking about the relationship dynamic between the client and the lawyer or decision maker. What is it about your client that's going to affect the decision maker? Is their mode of dress going to change someone's thought of them? Do they physically look different to other people? What are the gender expectations of the people holding the power in the dispute? And what is a way that we can challenge those gender norms without resulting in an unfavorable outcome for your client? Thirdly, are you making assumptions about the person that you're trying to understand?
So many people still don't understand that trans people even exist. Even those that do, they tend to not even reflect on the people around them. They're like, oh yeah, I know of trans people. I've never met one though. And they're people that go out into society and interact with people. They've definitely met trans people. They just didn't know because they assumed something.
It's very easy to think someone is lazy or disorganized, but there might be underlying issues there. For instance, mental illness, disability, challenging the norms that society has led us to believe and live by, allow people with different experiences to live better lives and live more accepted and tolerated lives. Fourthly, reflect on the cultural context of the person that you're seeking to understand. You're the one with the legal experience. You are capable of explaining laws to someone in a way that is appropriate and has meaning for that community. But you need to understand what metaphors and what truths work for that community. The same approach isn't going to work with everyone. Finally, throughout the entire process and on an ongoing basis, it's your turn to self-reflect.
In this day and age, people still don't want to self-educate, and they're always putting the onus onto trans people that they meet to be like, oh yeah, I don't understand, and usually being a bit rude about it as well. Just being like, oh yeah, I don't believe you, but also could you tell me a bit more?
You need to consider what you've learned from this exchange, what you brought to the table and what you were given back, how your worldview has changed, how your outlook is developing, and constantly and consistently be aware of what assumptions that you're bringing to the table.
You've been listening to Kangaroo Courts, a podcast by me, Theodore Murray. You can find us online at kangaroocourts.blog and follow us on Twitter at kangaroo_courts.